Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading Star of Light by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are reading Chapter 6, Adventures on the Way. Uphill, downhill, along the river path, Haman trudged on, becoming more and more exhausted. Kenza seemed to weigh heavier and heavier on his back. He remembered all he had left behind: his mother, Rama, the thatched hut, charcoal fire, the goats, and the dog with the torn ear. He felt afraid of the unknown he was walking towards, but he knew he must keep going. At last, exhausted, he reached the cornfield, and hiding himself and Kenza among the tall stalks, they fell asleep. Kenza woke before Haman, and crawling out from the prickly cornstalks she started to explore. She heard the sound of a grindstone, and with a cry of delight she toddled towards it. Grindstones meant mother and food and shelter and comfort. A woman sitting at the door of her hut heard the cry and looked up. She could hardly believe her eyes. Coming towards her was the strangest little figure she'd ever seen, a tiny child in a cotton gown, her outstretched arms groping and her face lifted to the light. Her black tangled curls had straw sticking out all over them like a halo. Kenza realized she was in a strange place and hesitated for a moment. Then she held out her arms and cried, "Mummy!" The woman sitting at the grindstone was a young woman whose only child had died 6 months ago. Now this baby staggered towards her, crying the very words she had been longing to hear. She lifted Kenza into her lap and began kissing and soothing her. Kenza knew that this was not her mother and started to struggle free, but although these were the wrong arms, they felt safe and strong, and the woman's hands were gentle as she stroked her curls. At last she relaxed and asked for a drink, and the woman fetched her a bowl of buttermilk. She drank every last drop and then curled up like a kitten in the woman's lap and went to sleep. It was evening when Haman woke up, feeling rested and comfortable. He suddenly realized where he was and jumped up with a little cry of alarm. Where was Kenza? He saw her tracks in the trampled cornfields and crept to the edge of the patch. What he saw gave him a real surprise. Less than 50 feet away, he saw Kenza eating cherries in front of the hut while a young woman laughed and tried to untangle her curls. Around them, they sat the whole village who had come out to stare at this strange child who had somehow arrived among them. Haman felt ashamed. He had fallen asleep, and they had lost a whole precious day's traveling, and worst of all, Kenza had escaped and could be, well, in an enemy's camp. He must rescue her quickly, for these people would certainly soon come to hear of the child missing from Thursday Village, the name of Haman's village. So once again, when the sun went down and moonlight flooded the village, Haman left the shelter of the cornfield and crept over to the doorway of the hut. Kenza had been put on a little mat covered with a goatskin. Haman scooped her up in his arms, whispering her name. She gave a little sigh and half woke, but knowing she was safely back with her brother, she clung to him tightly and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. She knew she was back in the right place. 5 minutes later, they were bumping up the hillside, Haman's heart thumping with fear. But no one had heard them, and the rescue had been perfect. Haman paused and looked up at the mountain towering above him and back to the valley and the river that led home. He knew which path he had to take and headed towards the mountaintop, which he reached just before dawn. Haman felt he was standing alone on top of the world, gazing at a range upon the range of rocky peaks. He knew he had to avoid Tuesday Market, a Spanish settlement where there were many soldiers who might be on the lookout for them. His stepfather would well have alerted the police by now. Haman knew he must make his way straight down the mountain to the river in the valley, 2,000 feet below them. He tied Kenza on his back again and set out, almost colliding with 2 men on horseback, whom he recognized as coming from his own village. Dazed by the sun, the men stared at him for a moment, and then one leaped lightly from his horse and gave a grab for Haman. "It's Sir Hamad's boy," he cried, "the one who's missing from Thursday Village the day before yesterday." Haman ducked and bolted down the mountainside. His sudden movement startled the horse, which reared in the air, and the man gave an angry shout, and the horse plunged forward. By the time the animal was properly in control, Haman was far away, leaping through the scrub, while Kenza bumping behind him. Not even noticing the thorns and roots in his cuts and bleeding feet, he went crashing on, not daring to look behind, always expecting a heavy hand to land on his shoulder and pull Kenza from him. The merchant, still clinging to the bridle, stood watching him. He had done his best, but he was not going to chase someone else's brat all over the scrub brushes and spoil his new shoes. It was none of his business, and he wanted to be good in good time for market. He shrugged his shoulders, mounted his horse, and rode on. He would tell the police at Tuesday market it was their job, not his, to hunt the runaway boys. But poor Haman dared not stop running, and Kinza, with her body nearly shaken to pieces, gave jerking wails and hiccups on his back. There seemed to be nowhere to hide. Once he caught his foot on a root and fell headlong. Bruised and dirty, he was up in a second. He had noticed a rock jutting out ahead of him. He made for it blindly, rounded it, and found himself close to a thatched hut, and beside the hut was a mud goat shed. Haman was quite certain that his enemy would appear at any minute around the rock, but this was his last hope of escape. He sprang into the close, dark shelter of the goat shed and found a sick goat and her kid laying on some straw. There was a pile of hay stacked against the wall, and Haman buried underneath it. Then, like a hunted rabbit, he lay panting and shivering for half an hour. When his heart was beating more normally, he wiggled himself around in the straw and began to look about his situation. He felt very ill. He was burning hot, and his head ached dreadfully. His limbs were heavy and stiff, and the straw pricked and rubbed his bleeding feet. They had nothing to drink that morning, and his mouth was parched from fear and running. Kinza, too, was miserable and wanted a drink. She had started to cry, sounding like a starved kitten, and she could not silence her. If someone came to the shed, they would certainly hear her. He looked around desperately, and then, for the first time, he began to consider the sick goat, which had broken his front leg. He cheered up at once, for here was the answer to his problems. Haman understood goats, and the mother with the kid would have plenty of milk. He wormed his way out of the hay and crept to the doorway, grabbed hold of a piece of broken clay pot that had been thrown there. Then, with one eye on the house, he made friends with the goat and the kid, fondling their ears and letting them lick his hands. Then, once she trusted him, he laid down on the floor beside the mother and milked it into a piece of pot. He carried the sweet, warm, frothing milk to Kinza, who drank it up and meowed for more. They drank as much as they could and soaked hard pieces of bread into it, for they were parched and starving. The excitement of milking and the pain of his feet and the stuffing heat of the straw pile and the fever in his body had kept Haman awake all morning. He was terrified of going to sleep, too, in case Kinza wandered off again. He looked around for a piece of rope to tie her to him, but there was nothing suitable, and he dared not go out until it was dark. At last, exhausted, he clasped her tightly to him and fell into a deep sleep. But Kinza, realizing he was asleep and wanting to do just as she pleased, crawled out of the pile of hay. She took a few uncertain steps and bumped straight into the goat. Kinza loved goats and felt perfectly at home with them, so having found what she wanted, friendly company and a place to lie that did not scratch, she crawled under the goat's chin and curled up to sleep. The little kid, no doubt feeling jealous, butted its way in, so they lay together with the goat's front legs around them, both quite content, the newborn kid and the lost baby. Haman turned feverishly in his sleep, soon tossed away the straw, and lay with his arms and face exposed. Towards sunset, the mother of the household came in with a bucket of milk to milk the lame goat. For a moment she thought it had another kid. Then she looked more closely and found it was a little girl curled up in a ball. "May God have mercy on me," explained the woman. "It's a baby." She looked around, puzzled, and caught sight of Haman's top half sticking out of the straw. "May God have mercy on my parents," she cried out. "There's a boy as well." She marched quickly over to him and prodded him with her leathery foot. She was a big woman with a loud voice, and she wanted an explanation quickly. Haman woke with a start and struggled to a sitting position. He was fuzzy with sleep, but realized at once that wherever he was cornered and caught like a rat in a trap. His head still ached terribly, and he lost all control of himself. He stuffed his knuckles into his eyes and began to cry. "Stop it," said the woman, slapping him on the back. "You're not from our village. Who are you, and where have you come from?" Haman gulped back his sobs and looked at her. He thought it might be best to tell the truth, and the woman listened to his story, frowning and nodding in turn. When he had finished, she looked at him kindly. It was a good story and seemed true enough. She had been married twice, and her first husband was very cruel to her and her child. He had divorced her when she was only 15 years old. She, too, had known what it was to see her child ill-treated and felt sorry for this unknown woman who was willing to risk so much for her blind child. Besides all of this, the woman had a motherly heart, and the bright-eyed boy who coughed as he spoke was obviously ill. She knew nothing yet about the filthy little bundle cuddling her goat, but at least she could give him a better spot to sleep in. So she milked her goat, and then, with a bucket in her right hand and Kenza in her left, she strolled to her house with Haman limping behind her. The house was a round mud hut, rather dark inside, with a stack of winter bedding for the goats heaped against the wall. A clay pot bubbled on the fire, and 3 little girls sat around her expectantly. As they entered, the husband came down the mountainside with the flock, and they all gathered around to eat. Haman had not eaten nothing but milk and bread for 2 days, and thought he'd never tasted anything so good. A lentil stew, flavored with garlic and oil, and red peppers with hunks of hot, soft bread to dip in it, and a bowl of buttermilk which they drank in turn, and finally a dish of bruised apricots, the unbruised ones the father would carry to Wednesday market at noon the next day. Haman felt his strength come back to him. For one night at least he would be safe and sheltered, and this made him feel peaceful, and his head stopped aching. The big country woman sat licking her fingers, and he gazed at her as though she were an angel from heaven. After supper, the 3 little girls curled themselves on the goatskins against the hay with a cat and her 3 little kittens for company, and went straight to sleep. The father went out to milk, and his wife followed, because she wanted to talk to him. Haman, sitting by the fire with Kenza leaning up against him, could hear their voices. He supposed that they were talking about him, and he was quite right, for the woman came back soon with everything fixed up. "Don't be afraid," she said encouragingly. "My husband is quite willing to help you. He is going to the Wednesday market tomorrow to sell apricots. He picks up a truck at the bottom of the hill just before daybreak. He will take you with him and say you are my sister's children, for my sister lives on the road to Friday market. Where are you trying to get to? She has a boy about your age and a baby girl. The truck will drop you off about 25 kilometers from Friday market on the main road, and you can probably get a lift, if it's not too far to walk." She looked down at his joyful face and suddenly felt sorry because he was so young and helpless. She fetched a basin and a towel and stooped down as she washed his bruised, cut feet, and then she tore a rag from it into strips and bathed his wounds with olive oil. And finally she laid him on one sheepskin with his little sister and covered them warmly with another. He fell fast asleep at once, grateful and unafraid, and she went and sat very still at her doorstep, her hands folded, looking out into the dusk. And tomorrow we'll read Chapter 7, Haman Completes His Mission. I love you, and I'll be praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.